need to make a slit drift and a flat drift. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to make those tools. What we're using is this high tension, high carbon shank off of wind turbines. We cut one of these in half, so we'll get both our tools out of one of these.
So here we are pressing down with our fullerene dies, and we're really extruding that steel out the end of our piece here. It's moving a lot of steel really quickly. And we're doing the same thing with the tapered flat drift here, just not as aggressive. We want to leave it a little bit thicker than our slit drift. And you'll see the difference in thicknesses here in the next few shots. This nice little opening here in the side of the press here makes really good shots here. And we're taking out all the hills, the high parts of our drifts as much as possible. We'll be doing more of that with a hammer later on, but this really does nice work when you're just trying to get stuff to a certain dimension prior to going to the end. This really does a good job. Get a nice look at how those fullerene dies are doing. We kind of missed the hills right there. We kept trying to hit them, but we got it. Now you can really see the difference in how hard we're pressing on this one versus how hard we pressed on the last one, where we were trying to get it way down in thickness, really draw that nose out on the slit drift so that we're having that nice taper going on here. And same thing, we're doing the same thing on the tapered flat drift, just not as much. So now we're just doing, we're basically working the piece just like you would normally work a piece like this with a hammer. We're drawing it down and out, taking more of those hills and valleys and making them flat, and really drawing a nice taper on the slit drift. Making sure to keep it uniform as we possibly can in this configuration, height-wise or vertically, as possible. But we're really taking it down and setting that thickness of the piece here, while keeping it as straight as possible in and out of the forge. The same thing, we're doing the exact same thing with the tapered flat drift as well. It's just like I said before, we're wanting to keep it as thick as possible because we're going to transition in from this drift here to a XI drift, which will be another portion of the series here later on when we get to it. We'll be making that drift as well. We have a small one, but we need a bigger one. So we use the small drift that we have to go through this slit that we're making, and then we may have a bigger drift that goes through that. So you just build and build and build and build on the tools that you're using. You can do it all with one drift once you get your slit done, but I don't necessarily have access right now to the air hardening steels and the heat resistant steels, so I'm using what I have, and so I need to build stages and steps. I need to step up or step down, however you want to look at it, in tools, so that when I'm not destroying those tools that I'm making. And this is really good steel we're using. This shank steel from the windmills that holds the blades on. It's very good steel. I don't know what steel it is. Eventually I'm going to send in a little wafer of it and get it tested to see just what we're working with here, so that when people ask, I can go, yeah, it's this alloy right there. So, all right, that'd be nice to do. We got a lot of these. I have a few still here at the shop, but I can always get more. So we're just continuing to work these pieces down, each one of these, and get them to the shape we want to get them to before we go to the grinder here pretty soon. It's just I'm just eyeballing this. I'm just really just going at it, with my eye and getting it to the look that I want. I want it a little bit wider than the strike plate and the handle where you hold on to it. I don't want it a lot wider. We have, the less steel we have to use to make something, the more steel we're going to have to make other things. So the piece that you get to see in the later episodes of this series is you're going to be looking at there like, holy cow, that's not a lot of steel to draw an axe out of. But actually, there's a lot of steel there. We're going to get a full-size axe out of this that is going to have a shortened handle. It'll be a 3-pound axe head when we get done here. So, but it's just a process you got to go through. And yes, you could do all this on a press or a power hammer, and it'd be way quicker. Now, if I was making these for a press, I'd make them a little more robust, so they wouldn't foul up and everything. And so I'd have less steps if I was going on a press, but I'd have to take smaller bites, if that makes any sense. Alright, we're over here at the grinder. We're on the ocularis here, and we're just trying to get this scale off. Now, I spent a good time in this configuration mainly to help set our bolster area up there at the top where my left hand is, the very top of our drift, that where it starts to get really thick and then back into the round. That's that bolster area. Same thing on a knife. And we're really just trying to set up that and make a nice transition there. It's not really taking much of steel off because we're going with the grain. If you really want to hog steel, you either go against the grain or you like underneath here. You're still going with the grain, but you're getting a lot harder bite. It's a lot smaller surface area that it's grinding, so you got to move really fast or you get to grind a channel into it. But yeah, if you really want to hog steel or wood off, go against the grain. Like I said, this is real easy to really screw up if you're not moving quickly along that surface. You're going to end up having to grind more and more off because you're going to leave little valleys and channels in your surface. And it's going to leave a little bit, but not much. It's because of the surface area that's touching the steel, because you're on such a small wheel there. It's really going down through that scale that was put on there. So now we're still on the slit drift, and it's a little bit too round for my liking. So I'm taking that a little bit of the round off, transitioning it over the sides here, because we don't want these sharp edges coming in when we get on the very sides of our drift here. We want it to transition well so that you're not malforming and overheating those points. And so we're trying to round those as much as possible before we get into putting the actual cutting nose on it. I've only done one side of this slit drift here. You can see in certain shots where how much scale is still on this. And this has been annealed, so it sat at temperature in the forge, and we shut the forge off, and it cooled down with the forge overnight. Now, the other annealing process this is not scientific annealing. You can't track. I mean, you can track. There is a certain degree of trackability with how quickly that forge will cool down. If you really want to be scientific about it, get yourself some vermiculite, some kitty litter, and heat your piece up to critical temperature, and then bury that piece with at least at least 4 inches of clay-based litter above your heated zone, above and below, and sides. So, and let it cool completely. You can also bury them in the ground too. Do the same thing with sand, dirt. When I had a dirt floor, I would do that. I would just channel everything out underneath the forge, and then when I get to the point where I needed to anneal something, I would just bury it in the ground. Just let it cool down. And all that's doing is it's cooling down at a very, very, very slow rate. So you're making sure that there's no undue stresses in your tooling, because this is gonna take a lot of beating. This tool is, and if your heat treatment's off, or if you didn't anneal it properly, if you didn't normalize, you didn't go through your heat cycling, if you had to go through your heat cycling, annealing does a really good job with taking all the undue stress out of a piece that you've built into it. Yet, will it hurt to heat cycle? No. And all heat cycling is, you heat it up and you go critical temperature, take it off, let it cool down, air cool. Then you heat it up slightly less, pull it out, air cool it, all the way down to a black heat around 800-900 degrees. It's looking really good, the pieces here. I'm really happy with how they turned out. Now we're starting on our bevel. And I started a little bit too steep here. I kind of I went a little shallower here. I didn't. If you have too steep, you're not necessarily wanting it to cut quickly, right? That's not the goal of this. If you have it too steep, too sharp of an angle, then it's going to malform the tip of your drift. It's going to start flattening out. If you have a much shallower bevel on here, then you're going to have a much more robust tool, and it's going to last a lot longer. Even when it heats up a little bit, it's going to heat up, you know. So a lot of people are like, well, why are you heat treating something that's going to heat up? Well, because you don't want it to bend. You don't want it to move as you're hitting with a hammer. I mean, you're going to see in later episodes here where I'm using a 8-pound short sledge to do most of the drifting on this, except for maybe a few shots in the beginning. And if this wasn't heat treated, you'd spend half your time re-straightening your piece here. Might as well, if you're not going to heat treat it, you might as well, with unknown, non-heat resistant, non-air cooling steel, you might as well have just used mild steel. I mean, to be honest. So you can see that bevel there. Now we're going to chamfer all of our edges. Take those hard edges down. We don't want any hard corners. Hard corners tend to snag on steel. It's weird. But you don't get a nice square slot by drifting it. You get a nice square slot by filing it. And so we don't care about how square it is right now. Even if we did care about how square it was, we would take a file to it afterwards. We wouldn't necessarily use a drift with super sharp square corners, because they tend to snag and hang. And that's where the heat will get to first, and you'll start ruining your drift. It'll actually start cleaving off steel as you go through that hot steel. Now we're gonna slack belt this here. Continue that rounding process. And the belt we're using here is just an aluminum oxide 36 grit that's been used. It's a used belt, so it still has lots of life left in it. But I was buying all ceramics, but they got really expensive. I think they're like $10 a belt now. And I know there's other ones that are more expensive out there, but I tend to go with one manufacturer, and they're just really expensive right now. There's no sense in buying them. I'll go buy a $2 to $3 freaking aluminum oxide now and just use the piss out of it. Now this process I'm doing right now is what's called slack belting. There's no platen hard surface behind it. It's a good looking drift right there. There's a few spots in it, but I'm not worried about that. That's not going to make that big of a deal. Nice little chisel grind on the end of it. Alright, same process here, guys. We're just not beveling the nose of this. I do know that I called this in certain places, like on the live stream, we're making a round-nosed flat drift, but it's really just a tapered flat drift. Now this is tapered on all four sides with a little bit of taper going down in the nose on the flat, and a pretty, not a heavy taper, but a noticeable taper on the vertical sides of the drift. We don't want to make the slot we're putting in our piece longer. We want to make it wider. We'll elongate that slot when we put the actual eye drift in it. And we'll show you in the next few episodes what I'm talking about here. Now you may be wondering, well, if you got to make another tool, why didn't you just make the tool right now when you made these? Well, with myself, there is a process here that it took me years to figure out, learning how I go about making stuff. It's easier for me to make a tool, especially ones that I necessarily haven't made before, because I've made drifts, but I've not made these drifts before. Ones that I haven't made before, I need a reason to make them. And then once I make them, I'll just make them all the time for no reason. So that's my process, is that I need a job for them to do, so that my brain is working in tandem with the knowledge that I have of smithing. So you can see us working down that kind of vertical, those two vertical sides. They're slight taper, and they're very rounded. There's no sharp transitions. It's a rounded, so that it's going to slide into that slot and get into that slot about an inch before it really starts picking up and moving and widening that slot out. Now we're tapering it now. See how much we're just really aggressively grinding that taper just into that first maybe inch to 2 inches of the drift right there. You don't want to go too much, because then you get something that's oblong and weird looking. And now we're going to go back here on the top belt and flatten and start working out, getting the planes all parallel to each other, adjusting our belt here a little bit. It's almost time to replace the platen on this. It has a glass platen on it, and in the move I lost the company name of where I can get these glass platens. So I'm going to have to call Mr. Lundstrom here. I need to call him anyways, talk to him about that power hammer, that air hammer. So we'll get to that here after we get done with our builds for February. It's not really a long process. Grinding is not the flashiest of parts of bladesmithing or blacksmithing. I enjoy all of it. Grinding to me is monotonous, but at the same time, it's still all part of the process, and I love every bit of the process. You know, the part I hate the most is waiting around for stuff to sell. You know, so that's the hardest part for me is waiting for having a place to store stuff. If I'm not using my pieces, right? If I'm not making them for myself, and it's just inventory sitting around, yeah, that's probably the hardest part. Now, I don't care about if this thing overheats because we're not grinding hard right now. We're grinding soft. If I was grinding hard, I would. That's another reason why I went to aluminum oxide, is that I'm not grinding hard. So there's no a ceramic belt doesn't heat, especially a sharp ceramic belt doesn't heat the your piece like an aluminum oxide would. So when you're there, if you're not grinding hard, which after quench and temper is done, then use aluminum oxides. They're cheaper for one, they're cheaper for two, and you're not worried about overheating your piece for three because you haven't gone through heat treatment. You've gone through just annealing it. And we're just, that bucket down there has water in it. Alright, doing the same thing we did before. We're chamfering our edges. The chamfer also helps make sure that there's no sharp edges, and you have less likely of a chance of any warpage or cracks coming out of quench. Once again, we're down here on the slack belt, just kind of finishing that round, taking any more burrs off. Like I said, this is, to most people, this is probably the worst part of bladesmithing and blacksmithing. I know a lot of bladesmiths that loathe standing in a grinder. I don't mind it. I mean, there are times that when I'm doing a complete run of something like my budget knives, where it is just monotony. It's terrible. And then we get the thumbs up, and here they are. Post quench, post temper. We'll see you on the next one.